This is Sean Doobie, and I am here at the Cloud Identity Summit, which is hosted by Ping Identity. It seems like this is about the leading conference for getting identity solutions figured out for where cloud identity is going. It's not a very large conference, but the people in here are the people that get it done. And one of those people is Patrick Harding, who is CTO of Ping Identity. And Ping is, the leading provider of internet security services, internet identity services.
Internet identity security software.
Security software.
Which boils down to, federation and SSO capabilities.
Right.
Essentially.
Right. Speaking of SSO, in your session this morning, you kind of said the theme of this year's conference is no passwords, or maybe more realistically, as few passwords as possible. This is the idea behind single sign-on, a concept that's been around for a long time, but now we're hearing major players like this morning, like Eric Sachs of Google, saying the same thing. And you'd mentioned that this is like a critical juncture for cloud security as it's starting to expand because of where you see the services marketplace scaling up. So much more is going to be available. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So if you think about cloud computing and think that and I'm sort of summarizing some of the stuff that was in my keynote this morning, and if you consider the fact that enterprises are only going to increase their use of cloud applications over the next 3 to 5 years, where I can easily see that reaching the hundreds, if not the thousands, in larger organizations. How you address the authentication problem and other aspects of cloud identity, which leads to authorization, account management, audit, as I mentioned this morning, that starts to become problematic if you think of every one of those cloud applications requiring a login form and an ID and a password to get into those applications. So the enterprise over the last 20 years has attempted to address the SSO problem internally and has done so relatively successfully through technologies like WAN products and Kerberos and Active Directory and things like that. But none of those technologies really extend to the cloud. So to start to think about addressing this sort of large-scale authentication problem, we have to start thinking about open standards, federation technologies, and protocols like SAML, or OpenID. I think Eric Sachs, when he was talking about it, we've sort of coined this, this phrase, no passwords in the cloud. I think that it's just a common set of interests of, we've all arrived at the same place now, thinking sort of around the same time, in realizing that really the cloud, we won't benefit from all the cloud can offer us if the user experience from a user standpoint is logging into these applications directly. That's just, we've got to basically get people to change that model and change their mindset very, very quickly.
It's in the industry's best interests to get it all figured out now and to start because changing the mindset will take a while.
Exactly. I think I used the analogy this morning that passwords are like hamburgers. They're really bad for you. They taste great. They're really nice to eat, really easy to get, but in the long run, they're really bad for you. And so that's what I equate passwords to. That said, to get developers to think about developing applications where they don't by default just presume they're going to have a password store and a login form as the way to understand who the user is, that's going to require some change. That we've got to break the mindset of 20 years there for them to think in terms of the starting point is a federated or claims-based model for how they know who the user is before they start, making authorization decisions and stuff like that.
Making that the default rather than the afterthought.
Exactly. Yes. And there's some other things that obviously, as I said this morning, we're not 100% there yet in the way, in the way we're going to approach this. I've been pushing very hard that the user experience aspect of this is very, very important. In that, if I want to show up at some random cloud application, whether it's a SaaS app, a PaaS app, or an IaaS application, users are trained today to expect to see a login form there. that has to change. And that's where Google's done a lot of research in what's the right model to drive a federated approach where the application could be smart enough to know where is that user's identity provider, where is that application going to redirect the user to for authentication before coming back into the application and getting access. And that's where, having a form there where they might ask you for your email address, which can give the application enough knowledge to know, well, the domain name associated with that email address equates to my organization, and now I know where to send the user to, for authentication.
Right, and we're starting to see some of that. And I heard defined, I went to one of the sessions this afternoon where the NASCAR paradigm was defined. And if you played on the web very much, and certainly, as Andrew Nash was saying, the younger generation is just completely into the web. So they run across this NASCAR analogy all the time. I wonder if you explain what that means.
Yeah, sure. So the NASCAR analogy is an alternative approach for how an application can discover who the user's identity provider is. So really, there's only sort of 2 or 3 ways to do this. I mean, it's a difficult problem in the context of browser applications. One is the identity provider information is actually in the URL that the user might type in when they try and access an application for the first time. So, for example, if I'm using WebEx, I might type in pingidentity.webex.com. That tells WebEx effectively who my identity provider is because they know I'm trying to get to the Ping Identity service.
Right.
Another approach is, as I mentioned, you ask the user to effectively type into a form of some form who their identity provider is. We can sort of overload that into their email address by asking them to type in their email address because the identity provider information, your organizational information, can be contained in the domain name of your email address.
Right.
The last option is you display all the alternatives that you have, effectively, of what identity providers are available. In the consumer world, you can sort of do that when the number of identity providers possibilities are in the 6 to 10 to 15 range, and you can show images of all of those identity providers, which is where the NASCAR analogy comes from, because you have lots of sort of advertisements on NASCARs effectively. So it's the Google image, the Facebook image, the Yahoo image effectively becomes like a little advertising banner. That can work on the consumer side where we only maybe have 10 or 15 that anybody might want to choose from. In the enterprise world, obviously, Salesforce.com, as an example, they can't put up the list of all 40,000 enterprise customers they have and ask you to choose which enterprise you're a member of, effectively. I mean, that just doesn't scale.
Right,
so
Google too.
Google as well, effectively, in the case of Google Apps. I mean, that just doesn't work. So, I mean, that's why I don't think the NASCAR model will survive, because we really want to get to a consistent experience of it, whether it's enterprise or consumer, which is where providing your sort of identifier associated with your IDP, whether it's pharding@pingidentity.com or patrick.harding@gmail.com, that can become the starting point for actually doing this sort of thing.
I'd heard the thought raised in the session that you could cache the identity provider in the browser. And so...
Yes, so providing it the first time at a relying party, it doesn't mean they have to prompt you the second time and the third time you come up. They can actually then cache your decision on what identity provider you wanted to use, so that you don't actually have to do that again the next time you show up at that application. So that's definitely a possibility as well.
Right, right.